Good morning. It's good to have you in our assembly this morning. It's very nice to have visitors with us, and it's good to see all of y'all, and welcome to our worship service this morning. We invite your careful study along with us today, and things we're going to be talking about are probably, it's a subject that everybody's fairly familiar with and something that you've all heard or thought about in days gone by. Our story starts in 1 Samuel chapter 17, if you'd like to get over there in your Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 17, and this is where we read about the story of David and Goliath. The Philistines, we are told, gathered their forces for war, and they assembled at Succoth in Judah, and they pitched their camp at Ephes-dammim between Succoth and Azekah, if I'm saying that right. And this is an actual map of that area. And as you see it, where the photo is taken from, and looks across, and you kind of see in the middle there a valley. And so as the scripture goes on there, it says, Saul and the Israelites assembled there and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. So the camp, as you see from here, located in the valley of Elah, and I think probably the Israelite forces, since it mentions the fact that each side is on a hill, probably the Philistines are camped on that side and the Israelites somewhere in this area. The fight, I think they all agreed probably was going to take place in that valley there, and that was what was expected to happen. But instead of there being a battle and them all going in and rushing into some cataclysmic battle, a strange thing takes place, and that is a giant. A giant appears on the scene. Somebody moved into the valley of Elah, covered in shiny bronze, and just an overwhelming and imposing figure. He is said, of course, to stand 6 cubits in a span, and I know that doesn't mean anything to most of us, but it translates out to the idea of about 9 feet, probably a little bit over that. We know that that giant's name was Goliath, Goliath of Gath. He was a Philistine and talks about being a Philistine. It tells about his bronze helmet and a bronze coat of armor. This man was so strong that he carried about this suit of armor weighing 125 pounds, the equivalent, at least in our way of reckoning things. He wore bronze shin guards, a bronze javelin slung over his back. I don't think it's an accident it's giving us all this information, because it's trying to convince us this is a formidable situation. This is a difficult thing that they're facing. One of the things we read about his spear. His spear was gigantic. It weighed 17 pounds, just the iron point on it. And it says it was a wood, more like a small log, like a weaver's shaft. And so it was an enormous thing. This great and imposing figure. And as Goliath moves into the valley and gets everybody's attention, immediately, of course, he begins to chide the people of Israel, the soldiers of Israel. And he says, why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and servants. And this Philistine went on to say, this day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. So it's kind of going to be one of those deals, like one man represent us all, and let's go out and fight this battle. And Goliath said, am I not a Philistine? It's kind of interesting, because really in the Hebrew, it's more like saying, am I not the Philistine? In other words, he's kind of indicating the idea, I am their man. I am the guy that's going to win this battle. I'm the worst, the baddest of the Philistines. And if you want to find out just how bad I am, then come out into that valley and let's meet face to face. Of course, arrogance drips off of this man, as you can tell, but when you're that tall, that big, that mighty, and have that kind of armor on, I guess it contributes to that. You got to kind of think, if you're 5'10", maybe about 25 years old in that army, you got maybe 2 or 3 kids back home and a farm, to take care of. do you go down there on your own and look at this guy face to face and hope that you can fight him? And I think the answer is no, you don't do that. And I can understand why they didn't want to go down there. In fact, what we find out is that even Saul, all of Israel, were dismayed. They were terrified. They were greatly afraid at what they were facing there. And in Saul's case, he is described as a man much taller than the rest of Israel. Not a giant exactly, but it says that Saul was a head taller than everybody else in Israel. I'm sure he represented one of their finest looking men as far as size and strength went. And so he's probably the most logical man to go down there and face this situation. But Saul is terrified. There's a special reason why Saul is terrified. If you went back and followed the biblical course, what you'd find out is that Saul at the beginning, when God first chose him, he was kind of aloof or shy. He hid with the baggage when it was time to appoint him. He was just not an outgoing man and not a man maybe particularly equipped for the task. But it talks about how the Spirit of God had come upon Saul, and he was able to fight these battles and win these battles. But you know, in the meantime, what had happened was Saul had turned and done his own way in several things. And when that happened, what we find out is the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Now, he had been dependent on God's help to get this done. And now, when it was time to go out and face a very difficult situation, he did not have the Spirit of God with him. He did not have the strength. And he knew it, and Israel probably knew it as well. So Saul, in the meantime, stood in his, behind the scenes, giving the commands, but not going out to face the battle. Goliath had gone out for 40 straight days, twice a day, morning and evening, and he'd gone out there and he'd chided the people of Israel. Every day it was the same, and every day there was nobody to accept the challenge. There was nobody to act. And so we enter the hero of our story, young David. David enters and he becomes the main man of the story. When he came, he's not the hero. When he first showed up, he really was delivering groceries for his brothers. He came to the camp on the with his father's desire to take food down to his brothers that were down there fighting in the battle, although nobody was doing much fighting right then. David's father had sent him. That's about 18 miles from where they lived. The Elah Valley is about 18 miles. You remember David and his family group lived at Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, and their family was a part of that community and a big part of that community. Well, what we find out about David arrives, drops off the food, goes out and talks to his brothers for a while, and David's kind of getting there as Goliath is doing all of his taunting. And the soldiers point out to David, as if you couldn't see it for yourself, but basically they say, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel, and the king has decided and made an offer. He'll give great wealth to any man who kills him. He'll give him his daughter in marriage. And I guess a lot of guys would go for that, but the last line, as I read one fellow say, he said probably the last line was most exciting of all. He'll exempt you from paying taxes. If you'll just go out and kill this giant, you don't have to pay any more tax. And that ought to get a little bit of attention. But so far, there were no takers in all of Israel. No one was willing to do that. Saul wasn't willing to do it. But as this situation goes on, David looks at it a little differently. And I want you to notice the difference in how David talks. David mentions the reward, but he says, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? That is a departure from the theme that's been going on for a while. What I mean by that is, all of a sudden, David changes the talk from the armies of Israel and the armies of Saul to the armies of the living God. David takes it as if Goliath is defying God himself. Goliath is out there saying these things, and David takes it as a personal insult to Almighty God. He looks at it differently. Now, if you think about how David is looking at it, David's looking at the situation from God's perspective. He's looking from higher up. You take somebody incredibly tall in our day and time, somebody like Shaquille O'Neal or somebody like that, and they're tall if you walk up to them and look. Obviously, if you're, just average height, they're going to be a whole lot bigger than you. But if you went up to a, high-story building and looked down from let's put it, a heavenly perspective, you wouldn't look down and see a tall guy. You'd see a guy that looks just pretty much like everybody else. I think David's looking at things from a heavenly perspective, and as David looks down, he does not so much see the height of Goliath. He sees the glory of his God. He sees his God is greater than these things. And that all, that kind of brings a question down for all of us, and that is, how big is your God? Is yours a big God that can overcome even a problem like this? Now, don't get me wrong, David's got his doubters, and we need to deal with them for a minute. Before he goes after Goliath, he has to convince them. The first one is a member of his own family. Eliab, his older brother, was questioning David. And he asked David, as if to criticize David for even being there, "Why have you come down here? With whom did you leave your sheep back in the desert?" Just for the record, he did make, the text actually says, he made arrangements for somebody to watch over the sheep. He's here at his father's desire, but he's being criticized. In other words, "Kid, what are you doing here? I know how conceited you are. I know how wicked your heart is. You came down to watch the battle, didn't you?" And David innocently looks at the situation and said, "What did I do?" Probably every favorite, older brother, younger brother communication there. What did I do? I didn't do anything. I wasn't trying to do anything here. But you understand that David has announced that he's willing to fight Goliath. He's willing to do something about it. And fundamentally, he's told, David says to King Saul, when King Saul finds out, of course, he immediately, let's get this guy. If he wants to go, let him go. And David comes in before King Saul, and he said, "Let no man's heart fail him because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul comes back at David, and he says, I'm sorry, thought we had something here, but you're not able to do this. You're a boy. You're youth. You can't do something like that. Sorry, would have liked to have had you, but that's just not a possibility. But you know what? Once again, David comes on the scene with his confidence in God. And David's not being cocky. He believes that he can do this with God's help. And so he said, "Well, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." Remember, David's a shepherd now. "This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who helped me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You see his confidence and his trust. You see how he looks at God in a way that he thinks, God's going to tend to me. Just let me go and do what I need to do. Let's talk for a minute about a pretty important subject here, and that is, what armor? How are you going to fight this battle, David? And I think that's what's on Saul's mind. Remember, at this stage of the game, Saul and David are in a good relationship. That won't last forever, but at this point it is. Verse 38 and 39, it says, "So Saul clothed David with armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not yet tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." That means I'm not used to all of this. As I understand the story, this is Saul's personal armor. If Saul is a big guy, if David's not that big, you can imagine, you're putting on clothing that's much, much bigger than what you normally wear. It's awkward to you. And David is not a soldier. He's not fought these kind of battles. So what we find out next is, it says, "Then he took his staff in hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand." Now, just for the technicality of the story, that's where that is. That's that valley of Elah, and that's the dry creek bed that runs through there. And you can see it's a place where you could gather up those 5 smooth stones. And those little stones, somebody that went over there and investigated it all, picked up those stones, and probably gives you a pretty good indication of what David might have fired off with his slingshot. Now, you know, kids like me grew up with the concept of slingshots that were very much unlike this. But this is what David uses. This is still used in some parts of the world. And literally, you sling that stone. You can get real good at it. It becomes quite a lethal weapon in the hands of the man that knows how to use it. So this is what, you know, basically is going to happen now in the battle, as I think a lot of folks know about. He drew near to the Philistine, and verse 41 goes on to say, so the Philistine came, and he began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. So there's a guy out there a little bit in front of Goliath with a big shield, and that's extra help, so it's kind of almost 2 against 1 even at that. When the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. Okay, you may be ruddy, you may be good-looking, but he's a boy. You know, you realize that. And Goliath is nearly insulted by all of this, and so he says, do you dare come before me? Am I a dog that you come to me with the stick? In other words, he could see David, it says, had a staff in his hand. And yet that wasn't even the weapon David was coming with. It says, you came out here to fight me with a stick? And it says the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Come on, boy, let's have it then. You want to be a big man, you want to be out here, then let's fight the fight. Now, I want you to look at how David's answer comes back, because it's really one of the greatest statements of faith in all of the Bible. Down at verse 45 through 47. David said to him, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I have come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Once again, I point out, it's all about God when David talks. David didn't come before him and say, you overgrown, overweight fellow, you know, look, I can take you any day. He said, you want to use a sword and a javelin, spear? I got something bigger than you. I've got God on my side. I can win this battle, not because I'm greater than you, but because my God is greater than you. So David puts the emphasis on God, and David lays it this way. And so he says, this day, and notice how David will not take credit beforehand for what's going to happen. This day, the Lord will hand you over to me. I'll strike you down, and I'll cut your head off. Today, I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David's biggest concern is God. And look what he says next. And when I'm through, the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel. Why did David say that? Because David knows, I'm a boy. I'm a kid. I'm out here. I don't know exactly how old he was, but he was boyish compared to the grown man of Goliath, and he was short compared to Goliath, and all looked against him. He said, they'll know that Israel has a God because they'll know I couldn't have won this by myself. That's what David's getting at. He's not cocky. He's godly. And he said, all those who gathered here will know that it's not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves. Isn't that interesting? For the battle is the Lord's. That's a beautiful thought right there. You sing a song sometime, probably have heard a song, the battle belongs to the Lord. That's what David's getting at. This isn't about me. It's not even about you. It's about God. The battle is God's, and He will give all of you into our hands. I used this a little different way about a year ago in a sermon, but I've kind of reformed it to say something else, and that's this. David didn't tell God how big Goliath was. David told Goliath how big God was. Amen. See, he saw things differently. He understands God is a big God, not just size, but in immenseness of power and greatness. And so it was that when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David, not run, not stand his ground, but David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. David ran in his direction, and David put his hand in his bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it, and it struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And then verse 50 says, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, no sword in his hand. So he struck down the Philistine and killed him without even a sword. Now, you may see in the picture, and it is true, David got a sword. He just took Goliath's sword, and he chopped Goliath's head off. Said, I'm going to take your head off. David had already said, I'm going to do that. But David didn't have a sword in his hand. He borrowed Goliath's to take the action. That, of course, inspired the armies of Israel. They ran out against the Philistine army, and let's just say it was a slaughter. I mean, the Israelites put them to shame. The Philistines went running down that valley of Elah. It really was one of Israel's greatest military victories of all times. But it was all because this young man saw things from God's perspective and looked at things that way. And I just can't get over the fact David got to that camp that morning, and he was nothing more than a glorified delivery boy, and by that afternoon, he was a national hero. Everybody will look at David as their main man from that day forward. Even though Saul is their king, the songs will be about David. They'll remember David from that day forward. It's amazing. Have you just told the Bible story, Pat, this morning to entertain us? No. There's a lesson for us in all of this, as there always is in any Bible record. The reason for the story, the reason it's in the Bible, I believe, is because there are yet giants in the land. There are things and people and places that would oppose us. And you know what? God is looking out here and He says, is there anybody like a David that'll step up to the plate and stand against the times we're living in? Do we have anybody that'll kind of man up, even though you may be a boy or a girl? Will you step up to the plate and be what you ought to be? You know, sometimes we find ourselves in situations like David was in. We are kind of on our own, and we face something bigger than ourselves, a giant. Not a literal giant, obviously, like David faced, but a giant problem. Maybe it's a giant temptation. Maybe it's a giant trial that we're going through. Maybe it's a giant sin that we fall into. And something has to be done about it. Something needs to take place. And we have to remember something, and that is, behind all provocation like that, you got the devil at work. You got the devil behind a Goliath. You got the devil behind a lot of the giants of this world that we have to face as well. And the Goliaths of this world, they may oppose us. We understand that'll be our lot. But we also need to remember their opposition is really to God. Look with me at a New Testament passage in Ephesians chapter 6 for just a moment. In Ephesians chapter 6, starting at verse 10, notice what he has to say. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Put on God's armor, because you're not going to be able to fight this battle by yourself. It is gigantic. It is something bigger than you. But with this, you will be able to stand against the devil. Really, the whole of a Christian's life is about fighting a battle, one battle after another for a lot of us, until the giants are finally dealt with. And you know, when you think about what do we mean by giants? A giant, by definition, is big. He's enormous. He's threatening. He's intimidating. You remember back in Israel's history? They've faced giants before. Remember what happened when they were trying to go into the promised land? The 12 spies went in, 10 came back and says, man, there's giants over there. There's men of great size in that land. They say something very interesting, by the way. They said they made us feel like we were grasshoppers in their sight. We felt tiny in their sight compared to them. And yet the other two spies brought out the fact. Caleb and Joshua said, yes, but God is in this picture. God will help us. But they couldn't see that. I think what happens sometimes, giant things, intimidating things of life, big things, they kind of take over our perspective until they fill the whole, they fill up our whole view like it did the Israelites back there. And that's all they could see were the giants. They said, yeah, the fruit's good, the crops are good, the water's good, everything's good over there in that land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey like the Lord said. But we can't do this because they're giants. You know what a giant is, young people? A giant is someone who blocks you, stands in the way of you doing what God wants you to do. Count that a giant. Count that a giant that wants to keep you, the devil using them to keep you from doing what needs to be done. You know, in 1 John chapter 4, verses 4 and 6, we understand there are enemies of God. They're enemies of Jesus Christ, and we have to be willing to stand up and be counted against them. 1 John 4, 4 and 6 says, you are of God, little children. You have overcome them, because greater is He that is in you than he that is in the world. They are of the world. Therefore they talk like the world. The world listens to all of them. But we're of God. And he who knows God hears us, and he who is not of God won't hear us. And that's how we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. There are false isms of all kinds of faith out there, bad ideas that people have that we have to stand up against and be counted. But listen, some of the giants that we all face are not out there, they're in here. They're inside of you. And things like lust and doubt and fear and discouragement and anger and envy and greed and indifference, addictions that people may have, controlling their speech even, as we studied in James recently, is a big thing. You know, I think if you think about it, what was the giant in Jesus' life? Don't you think it was the cross? That cross loomed big. And as he fought his battle in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was trying to make one final effort to come to grips with that. I got to go through and deal with that. But I want to tell you, I think all of us, especially growing up, we all knew the story of David and Goliath. That's one of the exciting stories of the Bible. But I want to tell you, Jesus marching and holding his faith steadfastly to go to Jerusalem and to know that he would die there, as we read about in Scripture this morning, that took more courage than it took David. There was something fearful on the other side, and there would be no victorious triumph that day. There'd be nothing for Jesus to deliver him. There's no slingshot. There's no sword that could get him out of this. It was going to have to be done. But he faced it. You might ask a question, why would God even let this happen? I'll tell you why. Because soldiers grow up on the battlefield in a bad way sometimes, but they grow up. They faced conflicts that they've never faced before. David had not been a soldier, but he was placed in a circumstance where he'd have to trust God. I'm going to tell you something I think is a unique way of looking at it, but I think it's true. I believe David needed Goliath. What I mean by that is David needed to have this experience. Israel needed to have it. Everybody, they all needed David's help and God's help, but David needed Goliath before he can turn into what God needed him to be as king over that nation. David needed Goliath. In the same way, we need trials. We need tribulations. We have to go through difficulties sometime. Can I point out something else real quick? We're drawing to a close. But we're going to have to face these things of life, our giants, our temptations, our trials, our situations we find ourselves in, because Goliath doesn't leave you alone. Remember now the story he came out for 40 straight days, morning and evening. And he wasn't going away until somebody met his challenge. So it is for us. We're going to have to step up to the plate, or we're going to go home just whipped cowards. He doesn't leave you alone. Again, remember, David approached him. David didn't sit back cowering in fear like the others. David ran when it was time. He ran towards the giant. A lot of our giants are the same way. They're just not going to leave us alone till we face them, deal with them, overcome them. Whether it's our temptation, whether it's our trial we're facing, we've got to win the battle. Another point, our time is really up, but I just want to make this point. Armor really mattered in this story, but you stop and think about it. In this story, we learn something about wearing armor and what that meant. David tried to put on King Saul's armor. It didn't work. He found that it didn't fit him well. He didn't know how to use it. Can I tell you something about God's armor? We talked about that passage from Ephesians 6, put on the whole armor of God. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:4, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. That means they're not earthly. They're not ordinary. They're not what men normally use. But they are mighty in Almighty God. He makes our weapons mighty. Now look, it's not that we're going to go out and use a slingshot, but the point is, God saw to it that David's effort achieved the end. It was God's help that brought it all about, and David admitted that. He said from the beginning. So we go back to that Ephesians text, and he tells us, Paul does, therefore, take up that whole armor of God, that you'll be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. To me, everything that he says here is almost modeled after this confrontation. Not because David puts on armor, but because David is legitimately putting on the whole armor of God. David's going out there with God as his weapon. Stand therefore, gird your waist with truth. Put on the breastplate of righteousness. Have your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Take the shield of faith. Above all, take that, which will be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And be willing to pray. He doesn't analyze prayer like he does the rest with some particular piece of armor. But on all those things, take your faith, take the gospel, take your prayers, take your willingness to stand up and be righteous. These are the things that will equip you to fight the war that everybody's in, whether they want to be or not. These are the things that will help us be strong in the Lord in the strength of His might. We don't need the worldly things. We need God's things. So this morning, you take a good look at your armor, and you take a good look at what you're going out to fight the world with, and are you ready for the battle? And remember how the battle has to be fought, and the convictions like David had. And remember, these are the things that are making you strong. Not worldly things, godly things that will make us fit to win with the Lord's help. And we can win. I guarantee you we can win just as surely as a young boy defeated a giant. If you need to obey the gospel this morning or be restored back to the Lord because you've fallen by the wayside, we'd like to see you take those actions. Come and be baptized into Christ, or if you need to be restored, we'll certainly pray with you in that regard. While we stand and sing.